Okay. All right. We are ready to go here. If we could get those doors in the back closed, that would be delightful. Thank you so much. Welcome to the last session of the day before lightning talks and closing, etc. I know, it's sad. I am here to introduce Lilly Ryan. Lilly is a software and systems engineer from Australia. She has consulted on tech projects in the financial industry for several years, and these days spends her time building and breaking corporate identity systems. Following a stint as an academic specializing in surveillance mechanisms of medieval Europe, more recent years have seen her teaching practical tech privacy to the public, giving talks on history and ethics of technology, and camouflaging herself in libraries. Please give her a warm welcome.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming. So this talk is called Don't Look Back in Anger, Wildman Whitehouse and the Great Failure of 1858. Before I get into that, though, I want to address the banana in the room. There are two of them. The bananas in the room. This has absolutely nothing to do with my talk. I just wanted to try it out. So I want to make sure that I can change my slides using these as my clicker, because I didn't bring one. But I did bring these things. So I'm running a current between those, into both of these and also into me. So hopefully, yes. Okay, cool. All right. As I said, this has nothing to do with my talk. This is pure distraction. So you know, feel free to focus on the banana or not while I'm talking. And we'll see how they survive, because bananas tend to go brown really quickly when you run current through them. Anyway, okay. Let's get on with the business of what you're here to hear about. Okay, so I'm Lilly, and I have been reflecting a little bit on the work that we do. And I know on the schedule that this talk is called Don't Look Back in Anger, Wildman Whitehouse and the Great Failure of 1858. But really it should have been called Everybody is Wrong Except for Me, the best scientist in the world, for reasons that will become apparent in a little while. I should clarify that when I say me, I don't mean literally me. For starters, I am not a scientist, but I am a software engineer, and a banana engineer now. Anyway, that's my Twitter handle, so you can say things at me on the internet if you'd like to. And I build software and break software and talk about software and all of that stuff. But as I was introduced earlier, I was a historian. And I investigated changes in social structures in medieval Europe, and I wrote Latin and read Latin and all of those kinds of things. And when I moved to software, I didn't want to leave those skills behind, because Latin is very useful. No, but because I think that being able to look back at events in the past and reflect on what's happened and take lessons out of them to apply to the future is really useful. And this kind of stuff helps us to build better teams and do better work, so I find it interesting and relevant. So in my view, successful reflection comes in two halves. We want to understand how we got to where we are, and then we want to apply those lessons to get to where we're going next. The problem is when a team only does the first half of this, which is what can often happen. You think about what you did, and you don't take any lessons from it, and you do it again. And you can get away with this for quite a long time if things are mostly going well. But when things go wrong, applying these lessons to future actions is really the only way that you can break out of that cycle. And it's usually when we fail that our projects are thrust into the spotlight, which is the worst time that we want that to happen. But let's talk about success for a bit. So one of my favorite things about the successful release of a project is the go-live party. It doesn't matter much to me if this comes in the form of an office party, or a few drinks at the office later, everyone goes out for a beer, or if you even get to have one at all, and you're not just sitting around the build pipeline lighting candles and hoping it will go green. But maybe one of the best, in my opinion, the best go-live party in history was in 1858 with the completion of the first transatlantic telegraph cable. But before I jump into the story of the telegraph cable, I have to pause for a bit to talk about what a telegraph is. Because I know that I've met people who are a bit shaky about cassette tapes. This is a bit older than that. So that's a picture of a telegraph receiver. And basically, telegraphs were the first internet. In the Victorian era, people started using them to send messages to each other along copper wires with electrical pulses. Sounds familiar. And mostly they would use Morse code for this. That's a system of dots and dashes that would stand for letters of the alphabet. And you'd write your message down, and you'd take it to the telegraph office, and they did it off to where it needed to go, and someone at the other end would hear the little clicks, and it would write that down and send that message on to the person who was supposed to receive it. It was better than normal mail, because electricity can travel much faster than trains or horses or people. So it meant that their messages got to the recipients faster. And by 1858, both North America and Britain and a lot of Europe had extensive telegraph systems across in the entire continent. And they'd had that for a few decades. And this was how most people did business. But to send a message from Britain to North America, or vice versa, in that same period of time, you had to put it on a ship and literally sail it across the ocean. That took weeks. There was no way around this. There was this gap. And so this was why, when the world heard that there was now going to be a telegraph cable connecting these two continents, they went absolutely nuts for it. The 1858 telegraph cable's completion was one of the most spectacular go-live parties in history. On both sides of the Atlantic, people fired cannon, and they launched fireworks, and they danced in the streets, and they wrote some of the worst poetry that I have ever heard. Here's some. "'Tis done. The angry sea consents. The nations stand no more apart. With clasped hands, the continents feel the throbbing of each other's hearts. Speed, speed the cable, let it run, a loving girdle round the earth, till all the nations 'neath the sun shall be as brothers of one hearth." There is heaps more where that came from. People really, really loved this cable a lot. And they loved it so much that they were still celebrating 3 weeks later, when it went dead. These days, when a big release goes bad, we usually have strategies in place. We don't always assume that things are going to just work. We hope they will, but we'll plan for the worst. We might have thought of a way to roll the changes back, or we'll plan a soft launch and test it before we announce it, just to make sure that things are really working. But the telegraph guys hadn't thought about anything except success. There was no fallback plan when this thing failed. There was just lots and lots of anger. We all like to feel like our projects are going to change the world. And often they kind of do. We change people's lives all the time with the software that we build. We roll out new products to make sure that the people who trust us with their business can do what they need to do. They make insurance claims faster when it really matters. They can split bill payments at restaurants painlessly. They can get live updates when there's bad weather coming. All these kinds of things are really useful and change lives in meaningful ways. But the transatlantic telegraph cable changed the world in like a huge and history-making way, like the invention of the car or the internet or the publication of the first Harry Potter book, the big stuff. Which kind of makes all the fireworks understandable from a Victorian perspective. I mean, maybe not the poetry, but we put that aside. But I hope it will also help you understand just how dramatic things got when this fancy, amazing cable just totally died. Wow. Oh, wow. Cool. We all like to feel, no, hang on. Next one. Yes, that was the next slide. All right, feedback for the banana system. Some of the stakeholders for this cable were particularly unimpressed. The Queen of England was the first one who wanted to use the thing. And because of that, these people really felt the heat. It's always a hard time when a project fails. I know a lot of us will have experienced this at one time or another. And if you haven't, you almost certainly will. No matter how excellent your team is or how good your idea is, not everything is going to go completely smoothly. But failures are also really valuable. For me, they've been the places where I've learned the most about myself. I've learned about how I am as a team player, about my technical strengths, about the strengths of the other people on my team and how we can best play to them in future, and how to bounce back when things go wrong. And I think that reflecting on your work, it's always a very good thing to do, but it's often richer after a failure. Asking yourself and the team, what did we learn, gives us really useful fuel for moving on and doing something better. Unfortunately for the Transatlantic Telegraph cable team, 1858 was only 15 years after the first computer program was written, 48 years before the first computer was built, and almost 150 years before the concept of agile development was born. So they didn't really have any models to learn from. But this doesn't mean that we can't still learn something from this project, because it was one of the biggest tech delivery projects in history. And in many ways, it formed the cornerstone of every modern development project. And the key person we're going to learn these lessons from is this guy. This is Dr. Edmund Orange Wildman Whitehouse. So Whitehouse, in addition to having the best name and the biggest facial hair of his entire team, which is impressive in the Victorian era, he was also the chief electrician of this project, which was basically the tech lead. And he was also the main architect of its demise. Whitehouse had a long history as a doctor and a scientist and an inventor. When I was doing research for this, I found a patent that he had lodged for a new type of roller skate. And he had dabbled in telegraphy as one of his side projects. And because he had patented a small number of improvements to various existing telegraphic devices, this brought him to the attention of a guy called Cyrus Field, who was an American businessman who was providing all the money for this transatlantic telegraph endeavor. So despite having no actual experience with implementing telegraph systems, Wildman Whitehouse got appointed as the chief electrician of the Atlantic Telegraph Company. The main problem with the transatlantic cable was that no one was really sure if it could be done. I mean, we'd had telegraphs for a while at this point, but never something that went underwater for such a long way. This continuous cable had to be over 3,000 kilometers long. And it kind of felt about as impossible as building a space elevator to the moon. At the time, scientists were still discovering some of the basic laws of physics that we take for granted today. Electrical currents and how they worked weren't especially well understood. They were being used for lots of stuff, but the principles that went behind them were still not fully worked out. And this meant that a lot of the ideas that people had about how to run a pulse across a cable that long were literally just guesses. And the only way to prove or disprove this theory was to build the thing, which was going to be very big and very hard and very expensive. Fortunately, Cyrus Field had no idea how impossible this was supposed to be, so he just hired some people to do the thing. One of the other people that Field hired to be on the board of his Atlantic Telegraph Company was this guy. He's a young man named William Thompson. He had fewer cool names and fewer credentials than Whitehouse, but he was also a keen physicist who had some really interesting ideas about electricity and the telegraph. And Field had discovered Thompson after Thompson had written a bunch of proposals about how you could build this telegraph cable, and he liked this guy's spirit, so he hired him. And when Whitehouse met Thompson, it was rivalry at first sight. Whitehouse was used to being listened to, and Thompson was younger than him and had fewer credentials than him. And he had his own measure of respect with the board, like independent cues to authority. And his facial hair wasn't nearly as majestic. Although, later in life, he would grow a beard so magnificent that it would make a hipster weep to see it. Anyway, the main point of contention in this time was about how the cables themselves should be designed to carry this current this very long way and still carry a signal the entire time. Whitehouse argued that the copper that they used in the cables to conduct the signal should have a very small diameter, but that the voltage used to carry them across should be very high and strong, kind of like yelling the current, the distance between the two continents. And he also decided that this cable needed to be very heavy so that it could sink to the ocean floor and not move. Thompson disagreed with him about the design of this cable from pretty much every point. But Whitehouse was confident that he was right, and he refused to hear any of Thompson's ideas, and he was the chief electrician, so whatever. There also wasn't much time to persuade stubborn people like Whitehouse that there were other points of view, because Field and the board wanted this project to be completed as soon as possible. They had got literally pretty much the entire population of 2 continents really excited about this thing, and their investors, and they wanted it delivered like yesterday, which I'm sure is also something we've all experienced. So they rushed out the cable using Whitehouse's design, and they stuck the 2 halves of it on a ship. One of these ships was going to spool the cable out into the sea across from Newfoundland, North America. And the other ship was going to do the same from Western Ireland. And the idea was that they would meet in the middle and join the cable, and you would have a transatlantic telegraph line. Pretty cool. This picture shows how they loaded the cables onto the ships. They basically made a little bridge, and they just rolled them right across because the cables weighed about an imperial ton a mile. It's pretty heavy. They couldn't just be carried. And unfortunately, Whitehouse's health wasn't very good at the time that this was all going on. And this meant that Thompson was the one who had to actually get on the ship and supervise this thing happening and carry out all of these cables that Whitehouse had designed, while Whitehouse stayed back on shore and waited. The first attempt out at sea was a total disaster. After about 3 days, the very expensive cables snapped and sank to the bottom of the ocean and were lost forever. So Field went and made his excuses to the investors and got some more money to make a replacement cable, which is what they're doing here. They're covering, in this picture, they're covering the cable with layers of this thing called gutta percha, which is a tree sap that you could mold when it was soft, and then you could mold it when it was warm, and then when it was cold, it hardened like plastic. They didn't have plastic then, so that was what they used. And because they didn't have plastic, they used it for everything, so much so that the tree nearly went extinct. But then plastic was invented, and now the tree survives. And I don't know how the environment feels about that. But anyway, after a year of very expensive cable making, the new cable was ready, and they loaded it all onto the ships, and they set out again. And the idea the second time around was that the 2 ships would start in the middle of the Atlantic and then go towards the coast from there. And it took them 3 more tries, sailing into the middle, meeting, and then sailing back out again. And every single time, the cables snapped and fell and sank. And in one of their attempts, the cable was almost completely destroyed by a passing whale, which is a picture, that's what's happening here. This was the original fail whale. But by the 4th attempt, they had made it the whole way across the Atlantic without the cable breaking. And it was connected to the local telegraph networks at both ends, and someone cut a ribbon, I presume, and it was declared ready for business. And this was the point where the entire Western world went completely nuts, and they kicked off that Go Live party that we talked about earlier with the explosions and the poetry and everything. This was also the point where Wildman Whitehouse sealed his own fate. He and Thompson had argued over how the cable had been designed, and now they were fighting over how it should be operated. As I said earlier, Thompson had designed this system to generate a very strong electrical current across the line. And Thompson had managed to get him to put some brakes on that voltage, so the system wasn't generating nearly as much power as it had the capacity to. But as the weeks went on, the demand for use of the telegraph grew and grew. You know, it's the one line between these two continents. Everybody wants in on this. Messages were backing up at either end of the line, and messages were not getting through as clearly as they could. They were dropping dots and dashes in the middle of the ocean. So Whitehouse secretly increased the voltage as high as he could make it, because his expectation was that the stronger the current, the faster and clearer the messages would get through to the other end of the line. The reality was that this amount of voltage completely fried the expensive cables. He had overwhelmed them with power, and they short-circuited into the sea, and some nearby sharks had boiled fish for dinner. So the upshot of Whitehouse's secret tinkering with this system in prod meant that this famous cable was completely dead within 3 weeks of it going live. And the world was very angry. And so was Cyrus Field, and so was the entire board of the Atlantic Telegraph Company, because they literally had one job, and they hadn't managed to do it. This is pretty much as big a disaster as if the entire internet had gone down, and they didn't know if they were going to get it back. When a project fails this spectacularly, and when this much money is involved, there's usually a lot of public head-scratching and soul-searching about what went wrong and where it went wrong, and questions get asked. And as you'd probably expect, the best companies will take some time out to step back and reflect on what's happened, see what lessons they can learn to make it better. And while most of the board of the Atlantic Telegraph Company was busy doing this, the one man who wasn't was Edmund Orange Wildman Whitehouse, because he had skipped right across this period of reflection and into blame, which is a pit that it's very easy to fall into. He didn't want to reflect because he knew whose fault it was. Everyone else's except for him. The public was so angry that this cable had failed that it demanded and it got a public inquiry into the whole project. It was one of the first project retrospectives to take place in front of the entire continent. And during this inquiry, William Thompson testified to the reams of his advice that had been ignored by the chief electrician, and others stepped in to testify that they had seen the chief electrician tinkering with the voltage levels on this thing when he had been explicitly told not to, and was completely against what the board had decided to do, and against all known scientific advice. So getting feedback like this is always a bit of a blow, especially when you thought you were doing a good job. And getting feedback like this publicly is even harder, because it's natural to feel defensive when stuff like this happens. And honestly, public feedback about specific individuals is not generally a great idea, but that is what happened. And it's not usually a great idea because it often leads to situations like what happened after this. Whitehouse hadn't entered into this inquiry with an open mind, but honestly, he hadn't entered into the entire project with an open mind. He was a self-righteous Victorian-era gentleman, scientist and doctor and a member of the Royal Society. And he was used to being treated as though this meant he could do whatever he wanted. Unfortunately for Whitehouse, there was no development community or anything like it in 1858 to suggest to him how he might tactfully handle this situation. So he did what any self-righteous, angry Victorian-era gentleman scientist would do. He wrote a pamphlet. And he published it, and he sent it to all the papers, and he had it published there too. The pamphlet was called The Atlantic Telegraph, keeps it brief, but a better title might have been Everyone is Wrong Except for Me, the Best Scientist in the World. I could describe it, but I'm going to let Whitehouse speak for himself here because it's better. The charges leveled against my ignorant unsuspicion are three of the most derogatory and detrimental, not merely to the fame of a public, but to the character of a private man. In the one case, however, error is but human. In the other, disgrace. From the first, my advice and wishes as projector had been disregarded and overruled. And as an officer, I had constantly been thwarted and obstructed in my operations. I do not shrink, therefore, from the avowal that, accustomed to such treatment, and aware of the incompetence and division of counsel existing in the board, I determined to do my best on my own responsibility to save the enterprise from destruction. I make no appeal ad misericordiam. I seek for no sympathy on scientific grounds. Sufficient for me that I have been identified, and from the first, with the great prodigy of this age, which may become a new starting point in history till the end of time. A great responsibility rests upon those who have in any way contributed to the failure of this enterprise. But for my own part, I can safely say that neither zeal, labour, caution, nor anxiety was wanting on the part of Edward Orange Wildman Whitehouse. And then he signed it. It may surprise you to learn that publishing this didn't really convince anyone that the failure of the Telegraph was not somehow his fault. At any rate, it convinced lots of people that regardless of whether or not the cable had been ruined because of him, they really did not want to work with him. After this, he was unasked to be chief electrician of the Atlantic Telegraph project, which was fine by him because he didn't want to work with them anyway. And then he folded his arms and he stormed off to his room or something. Unfortunately, I have seen many projects end this way. And this is a real shame because in 1858, it was already obvious that this is a terrible way to run a team. There are a few things I want to highlight out of this telegraph cable affair that I think are really important. Firstly, open-mindedness among your team is crucial to success, but it's also crucial to good failure. Constructive reflection can't happen if there are members of your team that aren't open to being challenged or having their minds changed, even by people that they may consider junior to them. Secondly, if the project gets to the point that things are really bad, feedback should always be given sensitively and with tact, and most importantly, privately. People are going to get defensive if they think they're being attacked, and especially if they think that they are having their personal value challenged in public. It's not a good time. Thirdly, in order to be effective, if you're going to do any sort of reflective, retrospective type thing on your project, try and follow the prime directive. This is pretty common in agile circles, but is really useful in lots of places. Regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. This here creates a safe space for reflection, where people can openly discuss the things that failed without any fear of being blamed. And it's also a good reminder for everybody who's in that reflection session that blame is not appropriate. Print this out if you have to, put it on the wall before you start talking about things like this. It can really help to focus this sort of session. Thirdly, and finally, is it thirdly or fourthly? Somethingly, there's no room for hero behavior in a strong team. The story of the first transatlantic telegraph cable may have been very different if it didn't include Wildman Whitehouse. While there were definitely problems with the way that the project was handled overall, they may not have even needed an inquiry after everything if they'd appointed someone else in the first place. It might have just worked. One of the strongest findings of the inquiry is that Whitehouse's behavior was a huge problem. Most particularly his inability to listen to the advice of others and his tendency to run off on his own and make crucial changes to the project without telling anyone else. And occasionally you'll get people on teams who want to be seen as heroes because our culture often romanticizes the idea of someone who swoops in and saves the world. And this is all really cool if you're like Batman. But if you've ever watched a Batman movie, you'll see how many people have their cars smashed by him, like having a battle with somebody, or bystanders who get their legs broken. And the same thing happens with heroes on projects. They might get some personal glory out of all of this, but the team members who ended up with bits of smashed building crushing their parking cars are not going to remember that person fondly. And they probably won't want to work with them again. This makes for a terrible team environment, and we all know that unhappy teams don't do good work. Here's a quick recap of all of that in case you missed any of it. This will be the slide to take pictures of if that's a thing that you do. So, with the moral of this story over, you might be wondering what happened to the telegraph cable project after the dramatic pamphlet incident. You'll be pleased to learn that the Atlantic Telegraph Company learned something about teamwork from their first iteration, and they appointed William Thompson as their next chief electrician. This was great, because in addition to having far more solid ideas about physics than his predecessor, he was also delightful to work with, and he knew how to treat his team with respect. And at this point, the Western world's demand for transatlantic telegraph cable was so large, and the Atlantic Telegraph Company had so much experience in laying submarine cable, that they didn't have much trouble getting more money to try again, which is good. And this time, they built the cables the exact opposite of Whitehouse's. Large in diameter, not quite so heavy, so they could be a bit flexible in the sea currents and not snap. They used a comparatively tiny amount of voltage to power them, and when they went out to sea the first time, the cable snapped again. But because they'd been through this so many times by now, Thompson and his crew knew enough that they could retrieve it from the ocean floor and repair it, and they went back for a second cable, and by the time the second cable had reached both coasts, they'd hooked the repaired first one up too. And this time they worked. And after they'd tested it to make sure that it actually worked, the whole Western world had another wild go-live party. And eventually they laid undersea telephone lines, and even more eventually there were undersea fiber optic lines, and we all lived happily ever after in an interconnected world. The end.
So as you may know, we do not have time for questions. Lightning talks start at 4:10. But before you go, Lilly, on behalf of the PyCon Australia organizers, there is a limited edition mug for you there. Would everyone please give her one last round of applause?